Pleased to say we're joined now by Treasury Minister James Murray. Great to have you with us this morning. The front page is dominated by what happened over the weekend. Key question then to start with, are you sure you'll have enough coal to keep the furnaces burning?
Well, that's why our officials are on site now, making sure we're doing everything we can to get those raw materials into the blast furnaces to keep them going. And, you know, I think what happened over the weekend shows the seriousness with which we treat the future of steelmaking in the UK. We took those powers over the weekend through the legislation. We've had officials on site since Saturday, since the legislation passed, and they are now there on site today as we speak, trying to make sure we get that raw material into the blast furnaces.
Has the coal arrived?
So the coal is in the UK. There's a process of getting it into the blast furnaces. There's a slight limit on what I can say because of commercial decisions being taken, but we're doing everything we can to get that coal into the blast furnaces to make sure that the operations continue.
Where in the UK?
As I say, there's a slight limit on what I can say because commercial decisions are involved, but there are lots of businesses, lots of other businesses like Tata, Rainham Steel offering to help out. So it's a real effort here to make sure we do everything we can to get those raw materials into the blast furnaces.
So do we take from that answer then the materials are not in Scunthorpe?
Well, as I said, there are limits on exactly what I can say, but we are doing everything we can. And the only reason why we have officials on site, the only reason we're able to take such a lead in terms of making sure we do everything we can to get this to happen is because of the action we took at the weekend. And imagine, you know, if we hadn't did what we did on Saturday, I might be sitting here with you today explaining why the blast furnaces have closed.
No, I hear
and that's
that,
a situation none of us want to be in.
Of course, but taxpayers are on the hook now. They want to know whether the move that you make will mean that the furnaces won't entirely go out.
Well, look, you're absolutely right to raise the question of, you know, what happens in terms of taxpayers' money, because we want to make sure we're spending taxpayers' money, you know, very wisely and sensibly. And actually, if you look at the decision here, we know that Jinye was losing £233 million a year. That's what their most recent annual accounts showed. So there is a loss being made. But if you compare it to what would have happened if the blast furnaces had closed, then the government would have had to step in and the costs could have been well over £1 billion in terms of what the government would have had to have done. So we think this is a good use of an intervention by the government to make sure that we protect the future of steelmaking in the UK, and that's the action that we're undertaking.
What if it fails?
Well, look, we're doing everything we can to make sure we get those raw materials in there, because what we need to do is make sure that we have a long-term future for steelmaking in the UK. Now, that's not something that we can secure overnight, but the powers that we took at the weekend, what we're now doing today, gives us that opportunity. Now, what we need to do is set out a long-term plan with a private sector partner to co-invest about having a long-term sustainable future for steelmaking in the UK. But as I say again, if I was here today and the blast furnaces had been closing over the weekend, we wouldn't even have that option on the table.
This is your moment to talk directly to those people in that community. Can you categorically say here, now, this morning, that the furnaces will continue to burn?
I can categorically say that we as a government are doing everything we can to make sure they continue. I can say we are a government of industry. We've supported other industries around the country. We intervened in Port Talbot, in Grangemouth, to support Harland and Wolff. You know, we are now intervening in Scunthorpe because we need steel making capacity in the UK. We need it for our national security. We also need it for our plan for change, delivering 1.5 million new homes, delivering all the infrastructure that we set out. We have big projects coming down the line, Heathrow expansion, the investment by Universal Studios, which we saw last week, all of the other investments we need to make in hospitals, railways, roads and so on over the next few years. We want to protect the future of steelmaking in the UK.
I hear that, but what about the people's jobs that are potentially at risk? Can you say to them, here and now, their jobs are safe?
So we're doing everything we can to support Scunthorpe.
Are you confident that will happen?
I'm confident we're doing everything we can.
And that doesn't really answer the question.
Yeah, because you know, we have to make sure that we get those raw materials into the blast furnaces.
Where are they?
Well, as I say, they are in the UK.
In the UK,
nearby.
but not in sight.
Well, they're in the UK and they're nearby. There are limits to what I can say because there are commercial operations going on here. But what we need to do and what we are doing is make sure we get those raw materials into the blast furnaces to keep them going. And I think, look at what happened in Port Talbot, look at what's happened in Grangemouth, look at the way the government has responded to other challenges that we face. We have said to people working in these industries, we're not just going to look the other way, walk away, turn our back on workers.
Will the materials be here today at some point?
Well, so the raw materials are in the UK. As I've said, I can't say...
On site in Scunthorpe. You know what I'm asking you.
I know what you're asking, and the commitment...
So give us an answer.
Well, the commitment that I can give you is that officials working on behalf of the Business Secretary are doing everything they possibly can to get those raw materials to the blast furnaces to make sure they continue their operation.
Do you think that's a satisfactory answer to our viewers today that might be affected by jobs if that furnace goes out? You can't give us categorically an answer that it will continue to burn. Well,
I hope that anyone listening to this programme this morning will understand that I am giving a direct answer. I'm being upfront about what we're doing. I have to be straightforward about what the challenges are that we face, but I also need to make clear what our commitment is and what our commitment to that community is.
Could you have acted sooner? There are union calls, I think, about 2 weeks ago that there were problems. There were staff protesting. Could this all just fail eventually?
Well, we've been acting since the general election. So since the general election, we've been working with Jinye, with the owner of the steelworks, and we've been negotiating with them. Now, we've made very generous offers to them to continue production in Scunthorpe. It's become clear to us in recent days that they were accelerating, in fact, the plans to close the blast furnaces. And when that became clear, that's why we acted so quickly over the weekend.
Because how much is all of this going to cost the taxpayer, do you think?
So we know, looking at Jinye's accounts, that they lost £233 million in the most recent year where they published financial accounts for. So they are losing money on it. And the Business Secretary accepted over the weekend that we expect to make a loss in terms of our involvement in what's happening at Scunthorpe. But the alternative is that if the blast furnaces had closed, the government would have had to step in, and that would have cost well over £1 billion. So in terms of spending taxpayers' money wisely, it is a sensible investment to try and keep steelmaking going in the UK, and that's why we stepped in.
What about the plant itself? It's old, it needs modernisation. Where will the costs come to make sure that happens?
So we want to find a private sector partner to co-invest with us.
Any interest at the moment?
Well, right now, it's about keeping it going, and we stepped in, as you know, over the weekend. I think, as the Business Secretary said in Parliament, the most likely option in the immediate future, it's still a very likely option that we'll have nationalisation in terms of the government taking fuller control over the site. But we don't, in terms of the long-term future of the site, we want to co-invest with a private sector partner, because that private sector
What's
investment...
the timeline for that? When do you feel like that will be a successful...
Look,
are you in talks now? Are you negotiating now?
Look, I haven't got a timescale for that now, right now. The absolute priority right now is to keep the blast furnaces open. We need to do that to keep the option open.
And categorically, you feel confident that will happen?
We need to keep them open in order to give us the option for bringing in a private sector partner in the future. So you asked about the long-term future, and let me be really clear that the long-term future, we want to have a private sector partner co-investing with us there to give steelmaking a sustainable, bright future in the UK. But we wouldn't have that option if we hadn't acted. If we had stood back and let the steelworks close over the weekend, then we wouldn't even be having this conversation. We wouldn't even have the option of finding a private sector partner in the future. OK,
there's so much more to come of this, but I want to ask you another question now. Political correspondent Amanda Acas has been working really hard on a story about high-pressure tactics used by HMRC on these sort of loan charges. You campaigned when you were in opposition and said that it was a form of harassment and that people needed protecting. What are you playing at the moment?
So the loan charge has affected a number of people. We made commitments in opposition to have an independent review of the loan charge. That independent review is now underway. And, I need to probably limit what I say about that because it is an independent review. We went to great lengths to ensure the independence of that review, so there wouldn't be interference in it. It would be genuinely independent. And so I need to let that review play out. We need to let it come to its conclusion. We expect it to report to us by the summer and then us to report or to respond to that report in the autumn. So that's the timescale we're working to.
OK, and just lastly, Wira Hobhouse, a Liberal Democrat MP, has been told that she can't enter Hong Kong to visit her grandchild. David Lammy says he's concerned. Your thoughts?
Yeah, we're very concerned about this. I mean, we need to find out exactly what happened. And I know that the Trade Minister, Douglas Alexander, who's in China at the moment, has raised this with authorities there. We need to find out what happened. But, clearly, it would not be right to prevent a British MP from entering another country purely on the basis of what they have said as a parliamentarian, what they have said in Parliament. And so the first thing we need to do is to find out from the Chinese authorities, why she was refused access.
But UK-China relations, you're confident we're all good there?
Well, in terms of our relationship with China, we've got to be pragmatic and cool-headed about this. And there are different ways in which we engage with China. It's the second biggest economy in the world. It's our fourth biggest trading partner. There are 450,000 jobs in the UK that depend on exports that we make to China. We've got to have a balanced relationship where we cooperate where we can, we compete in other spheres.
Do you think you'll summon the Chinese
them
ambassador, though? Will you summon the Chinese ambassador to find out what's going on?
Well, look, firstly, that's not a choice for me. And secondly, the first thing we need to do...
But it's a choice for your government.
Yeah, but the first thing we need to do as a government is find out why she was refused access. OK, so we don't know why she was refused access yet. As I said, if it was the case that she was refused access purely for what she said as an MP, as a parliamentarian, then that wouldn't be acceptable. But we need to find out the reasons why first.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for coming on Sky News Breakfast, Treasury Minister James Murray. Thank you.